President Trump suffered a handful of losses in Tuesday's primaries, with two endorsed candidates losing in Florida and another losing in Wyoming. Here to discuss is the Hill's campaign editor, Sophia Vento. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with Florida. Trump endorsed Corey Mills for the House, as you know, and now he's backtracking. I want to show what he's writing on Truth Social. He said, quote, "I told Congressman Corey Mills of Florida, a friend of mine, to get out of the race, but he wouldn't listen. He thought he could win, so who can blame him? We now have a great candidate, Ryan Elijah, running in his place. Ryan stands for everything MAGA and is respected by all. He has my complete and total endorsement." So what happened there?
Yeah, Mills lost by about 10 points yesterday to Ryan Elijah, who's a former TV reporter. And Trump had thrown his support behind him, although wasn't very, eager necessarily. He didn't re-up his endorsement in the days ahead of the primary like he did in other races. Mills had an uphill battle to win on Tuesday, given he is under investigation by the House Ethics Committee over some allegations of campaign finance misdeeds as well as dating violence.
Hey everyone, it's John, and this one is serious. The Trump endorsement formula, once a guaranteed win, is showing signs of wear. In key races, the golden ticket isn't so golden anymore. Even MAGA world is quietly admitting that the old predictability is fading. But this summer, something shifted. Something real and measurable and genuinely surprising. In state after state, Trump-backed candidates walked into their primaries expecting a coronation and walked out with a loss. And these weren't no-name challengers from obscure districts. We're talking about big names. A sitting congressman, the MyPillow guy with more national name recognition than half the people serving in Congress right now. A candidate who got Trump's endorsement just days before the vote and still couldn't close the deal.
Both Republicans and Democrats have called for him to head aside. So although he had the incumbency advantage, the name recognition, he was a controversial candidate. Trump's comments today are definitely not the first time this has happened. His chosen candidate in Tennessee earlier this month, Andy Ogles, lost. And Trump essentially said, I knew he was going to lose and, I was just trying to be loyal. So, I think this is just Trump sort of trying to save face a little bit and will obviously throw his support behind the Republicans in the general election.
Does it say anything to you about the primary voters? Because a lot of times the Trump endorsement means a lot to primary voters, but this time by that 10-point difference or more, that means they distinctly went with a choice separate from what the president endorsed.
For sure. And I think the biggest thing there is we do have a controversial candidate in Corey Mills that has had a lot of negative press and a lot of negative headlines. And I think that does just, the Trump endorsement can't erase that.
So Trump also made an endorsement in the race to succeed Congressman or for Byron Donalds. What happened with the president's endorsed candidate there?
That's not supposed to happen. That's the kind of result that makes political strategists choke on their coffee and reassess everything they thought they knew about modern Republican politics. Now look, I want to be straight with you because a lot of channels are going to take this story and scream that the Republican Party is collapsing. It's not. That's not what's happening here. And I'm not going to lie to you just to get you fired up. That's not how we do things. What's actually happening is way more interesting than a fake collapse story. And honestly, it's way more important for you to understand before November. Trump backed 17 candidates in open Republican governor's races this cycle. 10 of them won, 4 of them lost, 3 are still pending.
They also lost. He threw his support behind Catalina Loff, who actually formerly ran for Congress in Illinois. And this was a really weird, crowded race. There were 2 former congressmen, even a pardoned January 6th rioter. And the winner actually was a local media mogul, Jim Schwartzel. I think she lost by double digits, too. Again, I think it was a little bit of a last-minute endorsement. He threw his weight behind Loff in, I believe it was last week. But again, I think this was just a really crowded field too. So the vote was going to be segmented regardless. And the endorsement just wasn't enough to get her across the finish line.
All right, let's move to Wyoming, where the governor's race is taking place. What did we see with Trump's endorsement there?
She also lost. This was a tough night for Trump. He's had a really tough time with gubernatorial primaries specifically. She lost to Eric Barlow, who is a state senator, and really tried to sort of take the middle lane. His campaign website really focused on sort of respective, effective leadership. Whereas Degenfelder, who was the opponent, she was more MAGA Trump aligned. And I think this really speaks to, the primary voters sometimes wants a little bit more middle of a road.
So most of his picks are still winning. Let's be clear about that. But 4 losses in races that people assumed were locked up tight is a real signal. It's a crack in the armor, and cracks matter, especially heading into a midterm cycle where every single seat could decide who controls Congress. Here's the part that should really get your attention. This wasn't happening in blue states where Republicans always struggle to compete. This was happening in deep red territory, places where Trump's name is basically treated like a religion: Tennessee, Michigan, Minnesota, Florida. And in all 4 of those states, Republican voters looked at Trump's pick and said, no thanks, we're going with someone else.
Candidate for state office, which may differ for some of the MAGA firebrands we see in federal office. And that was the case in Wyoming where, Trump won 3 times in Wyoming. They're definitely a Republican state, but, there's appetite for something a little bit different at the state level.
During this primary season, every time a candidate that President Trump endorsed wins, we hear or see the headlines about how he has this grip over the party. Does this week alone tell you that there's a waning influence in any way?
I struggle to say waning influence just because he has been largely successful. If you look at the numbers, I think it's, a handful of races, maybe 10 that he's lost so far this cycle out of, I would assume, maybe close to hundreds he's probably thrown his support behind. But I do think the point is that he's really had struggles in gubernatorial races. I mentioned Wyoming earlier, but he has had losses where his first choice candidate has lost. Minnesota, Iowa, Georgia, and South Carolina in recent, so throughout this cycle. And I think it sort of speaks to, again, state level elections are a different, it's the same electorate, but people have different priorities at the voting box. And I'm really curious to see in future races, but also just, looking ahead to November, whether that's going to remain true with Trump's choices in the race.
That's the story tonight. Not collapse, not chaos, but a real, documented, verifiable pattern of Trump's endorsement getting tested and sometimes failing right in his own backyard, among his own base in states he's carried before. So why does this matter to you sitting there watching this right now? Because the whole game plan for Republicans to win the midterms depends heavily on candidate quality. It depends on nominees who can unite MAGA voters, old school conservatives, and independents who are still sitting on the fence about who to trust. If Trump's endorsement isn't automatically delivering the strongest nominee anymore, that changes the math for November in a big way. It changes who ends up on your ballot in swing districts across the country. And it raises a question that even a lot of Trump's own loyal supporters are starting to whisper about behind closed doors.
Is it common for a president to be this involved in down ballot races? Because he seems very involved in this primary season.
I think so. I mean, I admit I haven't covered this as closely previously, so I'm not up to date. But, we see on the other side of the aisle, former President Biden throwing his weight behind people, 2028 contenders and former presidential candidates. And I think the important thing to remember is to see, where these people are actually going in these races. Are they stumping? Are they campaigning? And they're really trying to churn out support. But again, Trump does have his unique way of, firing off those Truth Social posts. And it definitely it feels like a lot more than usual. And I think, he does really care about making, that impact and having that, hold on the GOP as sort of a kingmaker of sorts.
Now, it wasn't only losses last night. I know that's what a lot comes out of the headlines because some people were surprised or interested or shocked. What were some of the biggest wins that you saw for the president?
Yeah, he had a big win, obviously, with Byron Donalds winning the Florida GOP governor's nomination. He's on track to become governor in what is, a pretty red state. He'd also be the first Black governor in Florida. We also were watching the open seat for Cynthia Lummis in the Senate in Wyoming. And
is the endorsement still a golden stamp of approval? Or is it just one factor among many now competing with local networks, campaign cash, and name recognition built over years? Let's slow down and actually walk through what happened state by state, because the details matter here. And honestly, most people online are getting this story completely wrong. They're either saying Trump got crushed everywhere, which isn't true, or they're saying nothing happened at all, which also isn't true. The real story sits right in the middle. And that's exactly why it's worth your time tonight, instead of some 30-second clip that leaves out all the context. Let's start in Minnesota, because this one stings the most for Trump's team, and honestly, it's the one that got the most attention online. Minnesota Republicans held their governor's primary. Trump had endorsed Mike Lindell. Yeah, the MyPillow guy. Massive name recognition, tons of money behind him, a guy who's been on Fox News more times than most sitting senators combined. And he lost. He lost to Lisa DeMuth, the Minnesota House Speaker, who pulled in a solid percentage of the vote in a crowded field. Now think about that for a second. Lindell had Trump's endorsement, national fame, and deep pockets, and Republican primary voters in his own home state still picked the local legislator who'd actually been grinding it out in the state capitol for years. Building bills, building relationships, building trust. That tells you something important. Name recognition and a presidential endorsement don't automatically beat someone with real local roots and real organization on the ground. DeMuth had built relationships with county party chairs, local activists, and grassroots volunteers over years of quiet, unglamorous work. Lindell had a Trump post and a national media profile. Turns out in the end, the post wasn't enough to close the gap. Next, let's go to Tennessee, because this one is arguably even bigger since it involves a sitting member of Congress, not just some outside challenger trying to break in. Republican Representative Andy Ogles, who Trump endorsed for re-election, lost his primary to Charlie Hatcher, the former state agriculture commissioner in Tennessee's newly redrawn district. Let that sink in for a second. This isn't some open seat where anybody could realistically win. This is an incumbent congressman, someone already sitting in Washington with real power, with Trump's backing behind him. And he still got knocked out by a state-level official with deep Tennessee roots and years of statewide name recognition. Redistricting clearly played a role here too. When district lines get redrawn, incumbents suddenly have to win over thousands of voters who've never cast a ballot for them before. And that can flip an entire race overnight. But even with that context factored in, an endorsed incumbent losing his own seat is not something you can just brush off as a fluke. It's a real, measurable, documented defeat. And it's the kind of result that makes other Republican incumbents nervous heading into their own primaries. Then there's Michigan's congressional district. And this one is honestly kind of wild if you really sit and think about it. Trump-endorsed candidate Amir Hassan lost. And get this, he lost to a guy named Thomas Smith, who had actually suspended his own campaign weeks earlier, but was still on the printed ballot. Smith pulled in a majority of the vote anyway. So Trump's guy lost to a candidate who wasn't even actively campaigning anymore, wasn't running ads, wasn't knocking on doors. That's not a story about some rival political machine out organizing Trump's pick with better strategy. That's a story about local voters just flat out not connecting with the endorsed candidate, even when the alternative barely showed up to the fight. It's honestly one of the strangest results of this whole primary season, and it shows just how unpredictable these local down-ballot races can be, no matter who's backing who from Washington or how loud the endorsement gets. And then right at the end of this string of surprises, we've got Florida, which might be the most eyebrow-raising one of all. Trump endorsed Catalina Lauf just days before Florida's Republican primary in the open congressional district. Late endorsements are usually considered a power move in politics. Trump swoops in right before the vote and boom, instant frontrunner status. Game basically over. Except this time, it didn't work out that way at all. Media executive Jim Schwertel won the nomination instead, despite the late star power behind his opponent. So even a fresh last-minute Trump endorsement dropped right before voters headed to the polls couldn't flip the momentum of the race. That's a big deal because it directly challenges one of the core assumptions about Trump's political power in Republican primaries. That his endorsement, especially a late one, designed specifically to consolidate the field fast and scare off doubts, is basically an automatic win button. In Florida, on this particular day, it simply wasn't. Now, and this is important, so listen closely, because I'm not going to sit here and pretend Trump lost everywhere because that would be dishonest, and that's just not what we do here. In South Carolina's special Senate primary, Trump's endorsed candidate, Darlene Graham, actually finished first in the field. She didn't clear the threshold needed to win outright under the state's rules. So she's headed to a runoff. That's not a loss by any stretch. That's a very strong first place finish. That's just going to a second round of voting. And over in Wisconsin, Trump-backed Representative Tom Tiffany didn't just win the Republican governor's nomination. He won it in a total landslide. No drama, no nail-biter, no recount talk. So when you put the whole picture together, 17 endorsed candidates in open governor's races, 10 wins, 4 losses, 3 still pending, that's not collapse. That's not disaster. But it's also not the perfect, unbreakable track record that a lot of people assume Trump had walking into this primary season. And that gap between the myth people believe and the messier reality on the ground, that's exactly what we need to break down next, because it tells us something real about where Republican voters' heads are actually at heading into the midterms. There's also a pattern worth pointing out across all 4 of these losing races, and it's something most coverage completely glossed over. In every single one of them, the winning candidate already held some kind of public office or major public role before the primary even started. Lisa DeMuth was already the sitting House Speaker in Minnesota. Charlie Hatcher had already served statewide as Tennessee's Agriculture Commissioner. Even in Michigan, Thomas Smith had built enough of a local profile before suspending his campaign that voters still recognized his name on the ballot. And in Florida, Jim Schwertel had built a public profile of his own as a media executive with local visibility long before Trump's late endorsement even entered the picture. So this isn't really a story about Republican voters suddenly turning against Trump personally or losing faith in him as a leader. It's a story about voters consistently rewarding candidates who already had a real public track record and local trust, even when a bigger national name got dropped into the race at the last minute. That's an important distinction, and it's one a lot of the loud, angry coverage online is completely missing because it doesn't fit the collapse narrative they're trying to sell you. It's also worth mentioning the money angle here, because campaign finance always tells part of the story in these local races. Trump's endorsement usually comes with a fundraising bump. Donors see the endorsement and checks start flowing in fast. But in several of these losing races, the challengers had already built solid fundraising operations of their own, funded largely by local donors who had been writing checks for years. Money from a national endorsement bump can help, sure, but it can't always outrun a campaign that's been quietly raising funds and building donor relationships in the district for a decade. That's another reason these results caught so many people off guard. Everyone assumes national money and a big endorsement beat local money and local relationships. And in these 4 races, that assumption just didn't hold up. There's one more wrinkle worth mentioning here too, because it explains why this story is getting so much attention inside political circles. Even though the overall numbers still favor Trump's picks, primary turnout tends to be small compared to a general election. We're talking about a fraction of registered Republicans actually showing up to vote in these races. That means highly engaged, highly informed local voters carry way more weight in a primary than they would in November. These are the voters who know their state legislators by name, who follow local politics for years, who show up to town halls. When that specific group of voters breaks away from a national endorsement, it's a much stronger signal than if it happened in a low-information general election with a much bigger, more casual pool of voters. So in a weird way, these 4 losses might actually matter more than the raw numbers suggest, precisely because they happen with the most politically engaged slice of the Republican base, not with casual voters who just show up once every 4 years. Now here's the bottom line. And I really want you to sit with this for a second before you scroll away. This isn't a story about the Republican Party falling apart at the seams. It's not that dramatic. And honestly, anyone telling you that is oversimplifying a nuanced story just to farm clicks and outrage. What this actually is a real test of political power happening in real time, right in front of all of us. Trump remains the single most influential figure in Republican politics today. Nobody serious is disputing that basic fact. But these primary losses in Minnesota, Tennessee, Michigan, and Florida prove with hard documented numbers that his endorsement is not some magic override button that erases local political reality on the ground. Voters still have their own minds, their own loyalties built over years, and their own genuine reasons for picking a candidate they trust. And as we head deeper into midterm season, that tension between Trump's national influence and grassroots local Republican politics is only going to get more intense, not less. Let's talk about what's actually going on here and why you should care heading into the midterms this November. Trump's endorsement is still powerful, but it is not automatic anymore. And that distinction matters a lot. 10 wins out of 17 open governor's races is still a majority. That's still a strong track record by any normal political standard. And honestly, most political figures in modern history would kill for that kind of overall win rate. But 4 losses, especially in places like Tennessee and Michigan, where his backing should have mattered most, show that Republican voters are absolutely willing to break from Trump's pick when they've got a candidate with stronger local roots, better organization on the ground, or just more built-up name recognition over years of public service. This is wild if you really think about it, because for years, the entire baseline assumption in Republican politics was simple. Trump endorses, Trump wins, end of story. Don't even bother watching the race closely. That assumption just took a real documented hit this summer. It's not dead by any means, but it's clearly not bulletproof either. And that's a meaningful shift for anyone trying to understand modern Republican politics. Local organization and campaign infrastructure matter more than a lot of people give them credit for, especially in an era obsessed with national endorsements and viral moments. Look at Minnesota again for a second. Lisa DeMuth wasn't some random challenger who popped up out of nowhere. She was the sitting House Speaker, someone who has spent years building relationships with county party chairs, local donors, and grassroots volunteers across the entire state, one county at a time. Mike Lindell had Trump's name behind him and a national media profile from years of TV appearances, but he simply didn't have that same deep local network built up over time. And in Tennessee, Charlie Hatcher had already served as the state's agriculture commissioner, meaning he had real statewide name recognition and a genuine track record with voters that went far beyond a single endorsement announcement. This is a lesson that honestly should worry Republican strategists heading into November. You can't just parachute in a Trump endorsement at the last minute and expect it to automatically override years of patient local relationship building. That's just not how grassroots politics actually works on the ground, no matter how big the name is at the top of the national ticket. And this is the one that really matters for you personally. This creates real, tangible uncertainty for control of Congress in the upcoming midterms. Here's why this matters beyond just primary season drama and horse race headlines. The Republican Party's entire strategy for keeping the House and expanding their numbers in the Senate depends on nominating candidates who can actually win in November, not just candidates who can survive a primary fight. If Trump's endorsement is sometimes picking candidates who then struggle in a general election, or if primary voters are increasingly rejecting his picks in favor of people who might honestly be better prepared for a tough general election fight. That's a real strategic problem for Republican control of Congress heading into next year. Democrats are watching every single one of these primary results incredibly closely because candidate quality is consistently one of the biggest deciding factors in close congressional races nationwide. A weak or poorly organized nominee in a swing district can hand Democrats a seat they had absolutely no business winning otherwise. So these primary upsets we just walked through aren't just some inside baseball story for political junkies glued to Twitter. That could directly shape who ends up controlling Congress after this November. Pay attention to how Trump's team responds to this pattern going forward, because that response matters just as much as the losses themselves. Does the endorsement strategy change? Does Trump start backing candidates earlier, giving them more time to build organization before the primary? instead of dropping late endorsements that clearly haven't been working as well? Does his team start prioritizing candidates who already hold local office, since those are the ones who kept winning even without an endorsement at all? How Trump and his political operation adjust to these 4 losses will tell us a lot about whether this was a one-time blip in an unusually crowded primary season or the start of a real lasting shift in how much weight his endorsement actually carries with Republican primary voters going forward. This is wild to watch play out in real time, honestly, because we don't usually get to see political strategy adapt this visibly this fast in the middle of an active election cycle. Now, here's what to watch next. And honestly, this is the part I'm most curious about myself. South Carolina Senate runoff is happening soon, and it's basically the next real live test of Trump's remaining endorsement power. Darlene Graham, his pick, finished first in the initial primary field, but now has to beat Representative Ralph Norman head-to-head in a straight one-on-one runoff. No third or fourth candidate around to split votes this time. Just 2 people on the ballot, and voters have to make a clear choice. If Graham wins that runoff, Trump's team gets to point to it as solid proof his endorsement still carries serious, decisive weight even after 4 rough losses elsewhere this summer. But if Norman manages to pull off the upset instead, that's going to add real fuel to the growing narrative that Trump's endorsement power is genuinely shifting state by state, race by race, right in the middle of his second term in office. Keep your eyes locked on that South Carolina runoff. It might just tell us everything we need to know about where this is really heading next. And honestly, this whole story is a good reminder that politics, even in an era dominated by one massive personality, still comes down to actual people showing up to vote based on what they know and trust in their own communities. National endorsements grab headlines. They shape narratives. They raise money fast. But at the end of the day, ballots get filled out by regular voters standing in a booth, thinking about who they've actually seen show up for their town, their county, their district year after year. That's a pretty grounding thing to remember in a media environment that constantly tells you one person, one tweet, one endorsement decides everything. Sometimes it does. This summer in 4 different states, it didn't. So here's the breakdown of what actually happened and why it matters going forward. 4 Republican primary races, 4 losses for Trump-backed candidates, 4 victories for candidates with stronger local ties and more established political infrastructure. Minnesota, Tennessee, Michigan, Florida. Each loss tells a slightly different story, but they all point to the same underlying reality. Republican voters are thinking for themselves. They're looking at their options and making decisions based on who they trust, who they know, and who they believe can actually deliver for their communities. And sometimes that person isn't the one Trump told them to vote for. This is a meaningful shift in the political landscape, and it's one that both parties are going to have to reckon with as we head toward the general election. For Trump, this means his endorsement is still powerful, but no longer invincible. For other Republican candidates, this means there's room to win even without the Trump seal of approval. And for voters, this means their choices actually matter, even in primaries where the national media has already declared a winner. It's a reminder that democracy works best when people show up and make their own decisions, not when they blindly follow whatever endorsement comes down from Washington. The South Carolina runoff will tell us more, but regardless of how that race turns out, the pattern is already clear. Trump's endorsement isn't what it used to be. The golden ticket has lost some of its shine. And that's a story worth paying attention to no matter which side of the aisle you're on.